Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. The current session is about the possibility of predicting language change and variation. I hope and expect by the end of this session you would have an idea of how far it is predictable, how far it is possible to predict language changes that may occur in future. Well, my dear students, empirical research on language is limited only to the analysis of linguistic usage, both in the present and in the past. If we want to do any research on language, where would the data come from? Either the data would come from the present times, how language A, B, C, X, Y, Z, etc. are being used currently, or the data would come from the past, how a particular language, for example, language A, or how a set of particular languages, for example, A, B, and XY, for example, were being used in different time periods or at different time points in the history. It's interesting that since the data for any empirical study on linguistics and on sociolinguistics comes either from present or from the past, the third dimension of time, that is future, has a big question mark on it. The unavailability of future linguistic performance, which means we do not have any kind of records of what would happen in future, this makes it impossible to draw conclusions regarding what kind of changes would come over the time in language in future, or at a certain time point in future, how language would be different from today, or how at a future time point A, language would be different from a future time point B that is far off in time in future from time A as well. Well, the common view is that it is not possible to make any sensible predictions about future linguistic developments. However, different sociolinguists and different linguists, they have made certain endeavors to find out the possible ways of how predictions can be made. Here I would refer to Croft 2000, who assumes that language change is at least partly random. Now, my dear students, here what is important is the phrase partly random. This confirms two ideas. A, that there is something in language change that is random, that cannot be predicted. So about future, we cannot predict certain things because they may happen randomly. However, the word choice partly in this phrase, they are partly random, also tells that if to some extent partially they are random, it means partially they are systematic as well, and there are certain possibilities of predicting them as well. Lebov 1994 in fact characterizes language change as irrational, violent, and unpredictable. I would like you to look at the dates that I've given here on the slide. Croft 2000, Lebov 1994. What I would like you to notice is that over the times the concepts have changed. Lebov in 1994 was of the opinion or of the view that the change in language is not possible to predict. It is not possible to make claims about. Whereas Croft said partially it is random, which implied partially it is possible to predict some systematic or scientific change. Yet even if there should be laws of language change that apply regularly, and even if we knew them, we could not be certain that their premises are still going to be fulfilled in the future. This is what Keller says, and Keller's point of view is that even if we look at the present and if we look at the past and we try to find out a system of this change that is taking place in a particular language or in languages, maybe this system has worked so far. We do not know. We cannot be sure. We cannot predict with a surety whether the same system would retain itself, would sustain itself through the coming times or not. Since similar words may undergo the same change at different times, for example, the case of can and of may, which turned into modals at different speed. So, different words can have change at a different speed. We need to conclude that even if we knew the starting date of a particular direction of a change, we would not be able to predict what would be the speed of this change in the future and what would be the direction that this particular change would take. So, basically there are two ideas: A, the speed of change; B, the direction of change. And even if we know one of these, or we may make predictions about one of these, the other would remain unattended. Furthermore, my dear students, it is difficult to determine whether ongoing variation in frequency distribution is something that is going to be a full-fledged change in a language. What would be the scope? What is going to be the, immenseness of the impact of that change? We cannot predict that. Maybe some change may start rapidly, but it does not end up with a full-fledged change in the language. It can be vice versa as well. There is another problem, and that is the fact that even trends that seem to develop steadily may change for reasons that are inconceivable at this moment. Sometimes there are certain patterns that can be found in terms of change in a particular language or in certain languages. But, the predictability of the stability of those, channels of change, or the stability of, those patterns of change, that have occurred in the past or that are taking place in the present, we cannot predict about the future whether it would remain so or not. In the very first place, there are a number of elaborate discussions on how and why languages change. So to answer all the questions or the issues that I have raised, sociolinguists and linguists have tried to first of all think of how languages change. Labov has written extensively on the internal, social, cognitive, and cultural aspects of how these changes occur. As for the generally applying principles, one which is widely accepted is of the Uniformitarian Axiom. And what is that? It states that nothing, no event, no sequence of events, cancellation of properties, or general law that cannot, for some good reason, be the case in the present was ever true in the past. What does it mean when Lass says that? It means anything in terms of linguistic change that cannot be no sequence of events, no event itself, no cancellation of properties, etc., no rule, etc., that is not of any good today, that is not true today, it could not be and it cannot be true in the past. According to this principle, this principle simply extrapolates the future, and it means that any general principle that is, if we believe in this principle, any rule, any principle, any event that can happen today, according to this rule, that can happen in future as well. Well, when it comes to linguistic change, actually this is not a very viable idea. This becomes very difficult to understand. If linguistic change worked according to lay people's perspective, who would assume that what is happening now will simply continue to happening, in the future, this could just be a linear pattern, whereas if we look at the, the linguistic changes, we can realize that they are not in a line. There is not a pattern that is repeatedly, followed or observed. And as I said, this is a common observation that linguistic innovation does not spread in this linear way. Rather, linguistic, change is more, if we talk about the, spread of change, and if we talk of the predictions that we can possibly make, there is a model that is called S-shaped growth curve, and linguists believe that languages, they develop and they establish the changes through the times according to this model.